The men of Copper Falls had 100 words for cold. They spoke of powder cold and iron cold. They knew the dry, rattling cold that came down from Canada, like a landlord collecting rent, and the wet, seeping cold that crawled up from the river and settled in a man's lungs like a tenant who refused to leave. They spoke of killing cold and character-building cold, and in the saloon on Friday nights after enough whiskey, they made little distinction between the two. But the cold that was coming, the cold that was already in the last days of October 1887, beginning to press itself against the edges of the horizon like a hand against a window, that cold had no name yet. It would earn one soon enough. The town itself sat in a shallow bowl of land where the Dakota plains began their long, slow argument with the Black Hills. It was not a pretty town, not in the way that eastern cities were pretty with their brick facades and gas lamps and the comfortable weight of old money pressing down on every cobblestone. Copper Falls was a working town, a town that had been hacked out of the wilderness with axes and ambition, and a complete refusal to acknowledge that the wilderness might have opinions on the matter. The trees that had once covered the nearby slopes now stood in the form of walls. Great hewn timbers notched and fitted with an obsessive precision rose into the Dakota sky as declarations of intent. Every cabin in Copper Falls was a monument. Every roofline was a raised fist. The man responsible for most of those fists was Elias Croft. He was 58 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that had not softened with age, but only compacted like green wood, slowly becoming heartwood. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 4 decades in conversation with timber and stone. The knuckles thickened the palms mapped with old scars that had long since stopped telling their stories. He wore his gray hair short and his beard close trimmed, and he moved through Copper Falls the way a cornerstone moves through a building. Everything else was in some fundamental sense oriented around him. He had built this town, not as a figure of speech, not as a politician builds a town with policy and proclamation, but with his hands, with his back, with the 37 years he had given to this particular piece of the American earth. He had felled the first timber on the lot where the church now stood. He had mortared the foundation of the schoolhouse himself, on his knees in the spring mud the year his eldest son was born. He had designed and built the great log structures that lined the main street, each one bearing his signature in the dovetailed corners in the confident geometry of the roof lines. Elias Croft did not consider himself a powerful man in the way that bankers and politicians were powerful. He considered himself something more durable than that. He was a man who understood how things were built, and therefore understood how things worked, and therefore understood with a certainty that had calcified over decades into something very close to faith how things ought to be. He believed in order, not the order of laws written in ledgers, though he respected those well enough. He believed in structural order, the order of a properly laid foundation, the order of weight distributed evenly across a beam, the order of a community that understood which of its members were load-bearing and which were ornamental and arranged itself accordingly. This was not cruelty. He would have been genuinely baffled by the suggestion that it was. This was simply how things held together. It was this belief, solid, well-intentioned, and as unyielding as the granite beneath the Dakota plains, that brought him to the door of Marin Voss on the first Tuesday of November 1887. on a morning so bright and gold and deceptively mild that it felt almost like an apology from the season before everything changed. The morning that Elias Croft came to take her home was the most beautiful morning of the autumn. Maren Voss noticed this. She was standing at the single window of Henrik's cabin. She still thought of it as Henrik's even now, even 6 months after the fever had taken him, when she saw them coming up the track. 2 men. Croft in front on his big gray horse, his bearing as settled and inevitable as weather. Behind him on foot came Rutherford Gaines, who owned the provision store and who held in his leather-bound ledger the accumulated weight of every promise Henrik Voss had made and failed to keep. The light was extraordinary. It came in low and amber from the southeast, the way autumn light does in the final days before the world closes down. And it caught the frost on the dead grass and turned it briefly heartbreakingly beautiful. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone the color of old gold. The sky was a clean, uncomplicated blue. It was the kind of morning that made you understand why people came to this country and believed in it. Maren was 23 years old, and she had been a widow for 6 months, and she had learned in those 6 months that the world continues to be beautiful, regardless of what it has taken from you. She had not yet decided whether this was comforting or unbearable. She watched them come, and she did not move from the window. She put one hand flat against the cold glass. The frost burned against her palm. She had known this was coming. She had known it with the specific foreknowledge of someone who has been watching a thing approach across a flat landscape for a long time. Long enough to study every detail of it to understand its exact nature, and yet still to find when it finally arrives that understanding has done nothing whatsoever to prepare you. Henrik Voss had been a good man. This is not a eulogy, not an exaggeration. It is simply the most accurate thing that can be said about him. He had been good in the way that a well-made tool is good, reliable, honest, suited to purpose, without pretension. He had come to Dakota from Minnesota with broad hands, a willingness to work and a set of plans for a cabin that were in retrospect perhaps slightly more ambitious than his resources could support. He had loved Maren with a thoroughness that she had not fully appreciated until it was gone. Not the theatrical love of poems and gestures, but the daily unglamorous love of a man who notices when you're cold before you say anything and puts another log on the fire, who asks each morning how you slept and waits for the actual answer. The fever had come in late April, moving through the territory like news. It took Henrik in 11 days. She had sat with him through all 11, sleeping in the chair beside the bed, waking every few hours to check whether the particular quality of his breathing had changed. On the 8th day, when it was clear that the fever was winning its argument with his body, Henrik had asked her to sign a paper. He was not fully himself by then. His eyes had the distant, preoccupied look of a man trying to manage several conversations at once, some of them in rooms she couldn't enter. The paper was already drafted. Rutherford Gaines had brought it. Had been, she realized only later, waiting for precisely this moment of diminished capacity. She signed it because Henrik asked her to, because she was exhausted and frightened, and because the full meaning of the document, the extended repayment terms, the collateral provisions, the clause that transferred liability to the surviving spouse, was written in the careful, technical language of a man who made his living ensuring that other people didn't read what they were signing. Henrik died 3 days later on a Thursday afternoon in early May, when the prairie outside the window was green and the meadowlarks were being extravagant about it. And now it was November, and Elias Croft was dismounting from his gray horse in front of the cabin that was not yet legally hers, and the morning was achingly beautiful. And she knew. Croft did not knock so much as arrive. 3 heavy raps of his knuckles against the doorframe, each one carrying the full weight of his certainty. He did not wait to be invited in. He stepped past her when she opened the door, his great frame filling the small room. His eyes moving across the unfinished walls and the crumbling chinking, and the modest stack of firewood beside the cold stove, with the swift professional assessment of a man cataloging structural failures. Rutherford Gaines came in behind him and stood near the door. He did not look at Marin. He looked at the floor, which was the closest thing to discretion available to him. "Mistress Voss," Croft said. He did not say her name with warmth. He said it the way you might name an item on an inventory. A factual designation. "Mr. Croft," she said. "I'll come to the point." He turned from his survey of the cabin's deficiencies to face her. His expression was not unkind. This was in its way the most difficult thing about it. He was not a man who enjoyed this. He was a man who had decided that what he was about to do was the correct and necessary thing, and that decision had the same settled quality as all his other decisions, unrhetorical, done. "The provisions debt," he said. "The total with interest through the end of October stands at a figure this property cannot support if we wait for spring. The council has conferred. We've looked at the numbers from every angle available to us." He paused. Outside, a gust of wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the golden leaves let go in a bright cascade. From inside the cabin, it looked like something celebrating. "The property will be reclaimed as collateral," Croft continued. "The cabin and the plot, it clears the ledger. There's nothing left over on either side, but the account is settled, and that's what matters." Marin heard the words. She understood each one individually. It was their arrangement into a sentence that her mind kept refusing to fully process, kept trying to reassemble into something that meant something different. "Where will I go?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was more like a piece of arithmetic she was working through out loud. "The church charity hall has a cot," Croft said. "Reverend Marsh has been informed. You'll be warm enough there through the winter. Others are in similar positions this year. The wood shortage has been difficult for everyone." The charity hall. She knew the charity hall. A single long room at the back of the church that smelled of damp wool and coal smoke, and the particular exhaustion of people who have run out of options. It was where Copper Falls put the things it couldn't accommodate and didn't know how to discard. The old, the ill, the broken. It was not a place where you went to live. It was a place where you went to wait with no clear sense of what you were waiting for. "I can work," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not decided to make it steady. It had simply defaulted to steadiness the way certain things default to their essential nature under pressure. "I've been washing linens for the hotel, taking in mending. I can increase that. I just need until spring. By spring I can—" "Spring is too long," Croft said. Not harshly, simply. "The way you state a structural fact, the provisions account doesn't wait for spring. And this property—" He glanced again at the crumbling chinking at the gap, where the wind was moving visibly through the north wall. This property will not keep you alive through a hard winter without significant expenditure on fuel and repair that neither you nor the town's charity fund can absorb. You'd burn through everything trying to heat a sieve." He said the last word without emphasis. Sieve. A technical assessment. "We are in a way acting in your interest," he added. "A woman alone cannot manage a property like this, not through what's coming." Rutherford Gaines continued to study the floor with great attention. "What is coming?" Marin asked. Croft looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that was not quite pity and not quite respect, and occupied the narrow, uncomfortable territory between them. "Winter," he said, simply, as if that were a sufficient answer. As if that had ever been anything other than a sufficient answer in this country. He moved toward the door. He was done. The conversation was done in the way that all his conversations were done when he had said the essential thing completely, without loose ends. He was a man who did not leave structural weaknesses in his arguments any more than he left them in his buildings. "You have until the first true snow to vacate the premises," he said from the doorway. "After that, we will board it up. Reverend Marsh is expecting you." He paused. For just a moment, something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly, but complicated the way a surface complicates when you look at it in a particular light. "It is the correct decision, Mistress Voss," he said, "for you and for the town." Then he was gone. Gaines followed without speaking, without once looking up from the floor, his ledger tucked under his arm. The door stood open behind them. The wind came in and moved through the cabin with the careless confidence of something that had always owned the place, stirring the cold ashes in the stove, rustling the papers on Henrik's small desk. The plans for the cabin still unfinished, still hopeful in their neat, hand-drawn lines. Marin stood in the middle of the room and did not move for a long time. Outside, the golden morning continued being golden. The cottonwoods continued releasing their leaves. The meadowlarks, which should have been gone south by now, were still moving through the grass along the creek, searching for something worth staying for. In the 6 months since Henrik died, Marin had learned a great deal about silence. Not the comfortable silence of a sleeping house or the natural silence of an empty landscape. The silence of a life that has had its central fact removed. The silence of rooms that have been organized around a person who is no longer there. His coat still on the hook. His coffee cup still on the shelf. The particular dent in the mattress still holding the negative space of his shape. She had moved through that silence carefully. The way you move through a room in the dark. Washing. Mending. Hauling water from the creek. Taking in linens from the hotel and returning them folded and pressed, and smelling of the lavender she kept in a small cloth bag hung from the clothesline. Paying down the provisions debt dollar by careful dollar, slower than the interest was accumulating, but steadily, intentionally, with the focused patience of someone who has decided that intention is the only thing between them and dissolution. She had not gone to the church socials. She had not accepted the pitying invitations to Sunday suppers that came in the first weeks, dropped off with loaves of bread and careful, sideways looks. She had not cried in front of anyone. She had not asked for anything. This was not pride exactly. It was something more structural than pride. It was the understanding that in a town like Copper Falls, a young widow without family was a problem that the community was trying to solve. and the solutions available were limited, and none of them were hers. She could become a burden. She could become a wife again, transferred from one set of accounts to another. Or she could become invisible, manage her reduced existence with such quiet competence that the town forgot to feel responsible for her and left her alone to manage it. She had been working toward the third option with everything she had, and now Elias Croft had come and informed her with the unimpeachable logic of a man who understood structural load that the third option was not viable, that she was after all a problem to be solved, that the solution was the charity hall. That winter he had said, with a finality that she was still sitting with 2 hours later when the afternoon light began to go blue and the first edge of real cold began pressing through the walls. She had until the first true snow. That night she did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and listened to the wind testing the walls, finding the gaps. There were more gaps than there had been a month ago. The chinking Henrik had never had the chance to finish was continuing its slow surrender to the freeze and thaw cycle, falling away in chunks, leaving the logs naked to the weather. She could feel the cold moving through the room, invisible currents pooling around her feet, pressing in at the back of her neck. This, she understood, was what Croft had meant. She understood it not as a policy argument, but as a physical fact she was experiencing in real time. The cabin was losing this battle. It was losing it slowly, degree by degree, cubic foot of warmth by cubic foot of warmth, but it was losing. She thought about the charity hall. She tried to imagine herself there in that long, low-ceilinged room on a cot between Mrs. Peabody, who was 81, and had forgotten most of the last decade, and young Clarence Moody, who had lost 3 fingers to a saw blade in the mill, and had not been entirely himself since. She tried to imagine waking up in that room every morning for the next 4 months, looking out its single small window at the back wall of the church, waiting. She could not do it. Not because the charity hall was terrible exactly. It wasn't. Reverend Marsh was a decent man, and the hall was warmer than her cabin. But she understood with a certainty that bypassed argument entirely, that if she went to the charity hall, she would not come back from it. Not because she would die there, but because of what she would become there. The version of herself that waited. She got up, not because she had a plan. She got up because sitting still had become intolerable, and movement was the only argument available to her. She went to the wooden chest at the foot of the bed, her grandmother's chest. It had come across the ocean with Petra Lindqvist, who had been born in a village in the Carpathian Mountains in what was then the Austrian Empire, and who had arrived in Minnesota in 1849 with nothing except this chest. An extraordinary stubbornness and a knowledge of how to survive things that people on this side of the ocean had not yet learned to fear. Maren had not opened the chest since Henrik's death. She had not opened it for years before that, in truth. Since childhood, really since the years when Petra was still alive. And the chest was simply the place where grandmother kept things. And the things inside it were familiar and unremarkable in the way that all the specific details of a beloved person's life are unremarkable until they are gone. She lifted the lid. The smell of it struck her first. Old lavender, cedar. Something else beneath those, the mineral root cellar smell of another continent, of another century preserved in the tight grain of the wood. She moved aside the folded linens, yellowed but intact, the dried herbs in their cloth packets, a small glass bottle of something amber that had no label. Beneath all of this, wrapped in a piece of undyed wool, tied with a leather thong, was a notebook. She had forgotten about it, or told herself she had. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that she had known it was there, with the same passive knowledge with which you know about a thing you aren't ready to face. The cover was leather worn smooth with handling. Not Marin's handling Petra's over decades of a life spent in places and conditions that would have undone most people. She untied the leather thong. Her hands were not quite steady. The pages were thick and they were filled completely margin to margin with her grandmother's handwriting. Petra had written in the old language, the heavy consonant-clustered language of the mountain people. The one she had tried to teach Marin when Marin was small, before Marin decided she was an American. An American spoke English, and the old language belonged to a world she didn't need. She regretted this now in a way she couldn't have articulated. The words were mostly beyond her. But the drawings she understood. They were not the drawings of an artist. They were the drawings of an engineer, or something older than an engineer. A builder in the original sense. Someone who had studied the relationship between earth and shelter, with the same seriousness that other people studied scripture. The lines were precise, annotated with measurements, cross-referenced with arrows indicating the movement of air, the flow of water, the direction of the prevailing wind. Page after page of structures that did not fight the land, structures that grew from it. Houses dug into hillsides, their roofs covered in 3 feet of living sod. Cellars lined with stone that went deep enough into the earth to touch the constant temperature that lived below the frost line. And springs were everywhere in these drawings. Channeled and managed and coaxed into service, their steady subterranean warmth brought inside and set to work. She turned the pages slowly. She could not read the annotations, but the drawings spoke for themselves in the universal language of physics and physics alone. And then she found it. A drawing that took up 2 full pages, detailed enough that she could follow every element of it. A small circular building built over a spring. The spring's water channeled through the interior in a shallow stone trough along the base of the wall, a loop that captured the earth's constant warmth and distributed it through the thermal mass of the stone before exiting. A low, curved roof heavily sodded. The building itself partially buried in a berm of earth on its northern and western sides. A small pit just inside the doorway. Cold air denser than warm air would fall into this pit and become trapped there rather than mixing with the warmer air above. In the margins, in the old language, words she couldn't read. But 3, she recognized words Petra had said often enough that they had embedded themselves in Marin's memory before she stopped listening. Teplo Zemli, the warmth of the earth. She sat on the floor of the cold cabin with the notebook open in her lap, and she thought about the old Springhouse. It sat on the far edge of the town's chartered land, on a plot that the original surveyors had marked as unusable. Too steep for farming, too rocky for timber. No mineral value that anyone had identified. At its base, tucked among a stand of old oaks that had somehow escaped the axes, was a structure, or what remained of one. Dry stacked field stone, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with a partially collapsed roof, and decades of neglect. The spring that had given it its name still bubbled up from the rock at its base. Nobody used it. Nobody went near it. It was too far from town to be convenient and too ruined to be useful. The town called it a pile of rocks. She looked at her grandmother's drawing for a long time. Then she turned to the last page of the notebook. There was a single line of text there set apart from everything else, written in a different hand, smaller, more careful. The handwriting of someone writing in their second language, choosing each letter with deliberate attention. In English, unlike all the rest. She had to bring the candle close to read it. "Marin, if you find this, you are already brave enough." She read it 3 times. She sat with it in the cold dark for a long time. Her grandmother had known. Petra, who had crossed an ocean and built a life in a country that had no template for what she was, had looked at this granddaughter, at this particular child, with her particular quality of stillness, her particular way of going quiet, when things got difficult, and had known. Had written this line and placed it at the end of the book and trusted that the book would find its way to the right moment. Had trusted that Marin would find her way to the book. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls with renewed purpose, finding every gap that Henrik hadn't had time to fill. The candle flame leaned sideways and then righted itself. The cold ashes in the stove made no sound at all. Marin got up. She put the notebook on the table. She looked at it for a moment, then began methodically and without hurry to pack. She did not pack much. There was not much to pack. The notebook, wrapped again in its wool, placed carefully at the bottom of the canvas bag. Her cast iron pot. The knife Henrik had given her the first winter they were married, with the handle of elk bone. 3 blankets. Her heaviest wool dress and her work apron. And the boots she had resoled twice and intended to resole a 3rd time. The small shovel from the lean-to shed. A ball of twine. The packet of dried herbs from the chest. She did not take Henrik's plans for the cabin. She left them on the desk, still unrolled, still held flat by the coffee cup and the small river stone he had used as a paperweight. She did not take his coat from the hook. She went to bed and lay in the dark without sleeping, and waited for the morning. The morning of November 2nd was gray and cold and entirely without the previous day's apology. Marin loaded what she had packed onto the handcart Henrik had built in their first summer. A simple platform on 4 wheels that had been the workhorse of their small domestic operation. She added the small shovel last and secured everything with twine. She pulled the cabin door shut behind her. It latched with a sound she heard differently than she had heard it before. The finality of things. She went down the track toward the main street. The town was not yet fully awake. Smoke rising from chimneys. The distant sound of the mill starting its morning work. The smell of bacon from the hotel kitchen. At the corner of Main and 2nd, she passed the church and its attendant charity hall. She did not stop. She saw Bertha Olmsted at the gate of the charity hall yard, her stout figure wrapped in a gray wool coat, her breath pluming in the cold air. Bertha was waiting. She had, Marin understood, been told to expect her. She was there to help with the particular helpful quality of someone who has decided that helping means installing a person where they belong, and has come to do that. Their eyes met. Marin did not stop. She saw the look on Bertha's face shift from expectant to confused, to something more complex and troubled. She heard Bertha say her name. She did not turn around. At the provision store, Rutherford Gaines stood on the porch with his coffee, watching her pass. She felt his gaze on the side of her face, the specific pressure of a man calculating the implications of what he was seeing. She did not look at him. At the far end of Main Street, she could see the lighted window of Elias Croft's office. She could see his shape inside the broad silhouette of a man already at work, already managing the reliable machinery of his day. She did not know if he saw her. She turned the handcart north and left the main street behind her. The track to the old Springhouse ran along the creek for a quarter-mile before climbing the low ridge and descending into the rocky ground below the hills. She had not been out this way since the summer before Henrik died, when they had walked out here on a Sunday afternoon, and she had told him about the spring and the old stone structure, and he had listened with the serious, considering attention he gave to everything she said, and then said, "We'd have to go a long way to find worse building ground." He had been right from a certain angle. She walked the track alone, pulling the handcart behind her. The creek was running lower than it should have been for November, the drought of the previous summer, still pulling at the water table. Above her, the sky had closed down to a uniform low gray, the kind that holds its cards close, gives nothing away. She walked for 40 minutes. And then she was there. The Springhouse was worse than she remembered. The roof had partially collapsed, one corner of it folded inward like a piece of paper that someone had pushed on from above. Through the gap, she could see the sky gray indifferent. The interior was choked with fallen leaves and animal nests and the compressed detritus of years of vacancy. The dry, stacked stone walls had shifted in places where the ground had heaved and settled through successive freeze-thaw cycles, opening gaps wide enough to put a hand through. She stood in the doorway. The doorway, at least, was still standing, its stone lintel solid overhead, and looked at what she had come to build a life in. She was very aware in that moment of the distance between herself and the town behind her. The distance between herself and any person who might help her. The distance between the notebook and the drawing in the notebook, and this specific pile of stones in this specific hollow, on this specific cold November morning. She thought about the charity hall. She thought about Elias Croft's voice saying the word sieve. Then she went to the back of the structure where the fissure in the bedrock opened up beneath the original stone basin. She crouched down and put her hand in the water. It was not what she expected. After weeks of temperatures that had been systematically stripping the warmth from every surface it touched, she had expected the water to be punishing. Instead, it was merely cool in the way a cellar is cool in summer. Steady. Constant. Not the cold of something exposed and at the mercy of the weather, but the cool of something that came from so deep in the earth that the weather had no jurisdiction over it. The warmth of the earth, relative to what surrounded it, relative to the air that was going to keep getting colder for the next 3 months. This water was warm. It was a resource. It was the thing on which everything else could be built. She stood up. She looked at the collapsed roof, the gap walls, the accumulated neglect. She put down the handles of the handcart. She picked up the shovel. She began. The first 3 days were excavation, not the romantic, purposeful excavation of a person with a clear plan, but the necessary, brutal excavation of a person clearing the site on which a plan might eventually be possible. She pulled dead branches and leaf matter from the interior by the armload. She pried loose the collapsed section of roof with a branch she used as a lever, working the heavy timbers free one at a time and stacking them nearby. She would need them later. She shoveled out layers of compacted damp earth from the floor until she reached the original flagstone beneath. She slept outside, tucked against the south wall, where the stones held a thin reserve of the day's minimal warmth. She woke each morning with her muscles in revolt, and her hands stiff and her breath making small clouds in the gray air. She drank water from the spring and ate from the small store she had packed, and did not think very far into the future, because the future was a direction that currently led nowhere she could afford to look. On the fourth day, Bertha Olmsted came. She appeared on the track in the early afternoon, a stout, determined figure, in her gray coat carrying a small basket. She picked her way across the rocky ground with the careful steps of a woman who has decided that what she is doing is necessary, and is therefore going to do it regardless of the terrain's opinion. She stopped at the edge of what Marin had cleared and surveyed the scene, Marin herself caked in mud, to the elbows hair loose and working itself free from its pins, surrounded by excavated debris and the modest evidence of 3 days of extremely hard work. Bertha's face did the specific thing that faces do when they arrive at a kindly intended conclusion that they have already decided upon before gathering any evidence. It went soft with a sorrow that was also at its edges a verdict. "Child," she said. Her voice was genuinely gentle. "What are you doing?" Marin straightened. Her back made its objection known in careful detail. "What I have to," she said. "This is no place to spend the winter." Bertha set her basket down on a flat stone. Inside it, Marin could see a heel of bread, a piece of hard cheese, a small jar of apple butter. "Come back to town. You can stay with me. I know it's not much, but it's warm, and it's—" "Thank you," Marin said. She meant it. Bertha Olmsted had known her since she was 12 years old, had stood at the back of the church the day she and Henrik were married, with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated goodwill. She was not a bad woman. She was a woman operating entirely within the logic of the world she understood. "I will see this through." She pointed to the spring. "That is my stove," she said. She put her hand on the damp stone wall. "And these are my timbers." Bertha looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something that either means nothing at all or means something so far outside the current frame of reference that the frame would have to be replaced entirely to accommodate it. She left the basket. She went back the way she had come. Marin watched her figure diminish on the track until it was just a gray shape, and then just the track. Then she picked up the shovel and went back to work. The real work began in the second week. She had read the drawings in the notebook 100 times by then. She had studied them by candlelight in the evenings until the candlelight failed, and then traced the lines from memory in the dark. She understood the principles now not merely as drawings, but as physics, as the logic of heat and mass, and the relationship between the Earth's constant temperature and the variable cruelty of the air above it. The berm first. She had to bury the structure's most exposed sides, the north and west walls, the faces that would take the force of the prevailing winter winds in enough earth to break the wind's direct contact with the stone, and to extend the thermal insulation of the deep ground up around the building's flanks. She began to dig the trench, not inside the building, but outside along the north and west walls, starting at the base and going down 4 feet, 5 feet, working below the frost line to where the soil was still soft and cohesive, and where a different temperature lived. A temperature that was a negotiation between the surface world and the deep earth. Her hands blistered on the second day of digging. The blisters broke on the third. She tore strips from her petticoat and wrapped them and kept digging. The rhythm of it became its own world. The bite of the blade, the lift and the turn, the thud of earth on the growing pile. Dig, lift, turn. Dig, lift, turn. On the 17th of November, Elias Croft rode past on his big gray horse. He was heading up toward the high country with a party of loggers, a last desperate attempt to haul timber down before the trails closed. He saw her in the trench, just her head and shoulders visible above the edge. Her face flushed with cold and effort, and he reined in. He looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a man who has spent his life reading structural situations. "Woman's folly," he said. His voice carried easily on the cold air, not cruel declarative, the tone of a man who has made an accurate identification. "That stone will draw the cold like a magnet. You'll be a block of ice before the new year. I told you what winter does to a woman alone." He shook his head with the slow, heavy certainty of someone whose experience of being correct has been extensive. "I warned you." He did not wait for a reply. He spurred the gray horse and moved on up the track, the loggers following in a loose line, the sound of their horses fading into the cold gray distance. Marin stood in the trench, a block of ice. She looked at the stone wall in front of her. Then she thought about what her grandmother had understood, what Petra had drawn in careful, precise lines in that notebook, what she had tried to teach a young girl who was too busy becoming American to listen. Dense stone properly managed was not a conductor of cold. It was a battery of warmth, slow to change, slow to give back, but steadfast in the way that surfaces exposed to constant change could never be. She picked up the shovel. She kept digging. On the evening of the 19th of November, she found the clay. She had been testing the soil along the creek bank, digging small probes and examining what she brought up, looking for the specific plastic stickiness that Petra had indicated in the notebook's margin drawings. Not the gritty, sandy soil that dominated much of the creek bank, but the dense gray clay that lay below under the roots of the fallen cottonwood. The true structural clay that holds its shape and seals its seams and dries to something approaching stone. She knelt in the mud and pressed a piece of it between her fingers. It held the impression perfectly. It was cold and it was dense and it smelled of the deep earth, and it was exactly what she needed. She spent 2 days hauling it back to the Springhouse in her apron load by load until she had enough piled against the south wall to begin the chinking. She built the mixture the way the notebook showed clay and water, and dried grass cut into short lengths and mixed with her feet in a shallow depression. She dug in the ground, stomping it in the cold, until her feet went numb and then went past numb to something that was simply absence, a region of her body that had temporarily agreed to be non-functional for the greater purpose. And then she took out her knife. She reached up and gathered her hair, the heavy dark mass of it which she had kept braided and pinned for as long as she could remember, which Henrik had liked to hold in his hands in the early evenings, which was one of the last physical things in this world that connected her to who she had been when he was alive. She cut it. She worked the hanks into the clay mixture. It would bind it. It would give the chinking a tensile strength that grass alone couldn't provide. It was the correct thing to do. The practical thing, the thing the notebook indicated. It was also the particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself, that simply happens in the course of doing what needs to be done and is not the less genuine for being quiet. She worked the chinking into the walls with her bare hands, forcing the cold clay into every crack, feeling the stone under her palms and the clay filling the spaces between, and the structure slowly, incrementally becoming whole. She did not think about what she was losing. She thought about what she was building. Outside, the sky was the color of old iron, and somewhere north of the Dakota border, something vast and patient and cold was gathering itself. But that was still 2 weeks away. She had work to do. The chinking took 9 days. 9 days of cold clay and numb hands, and the slow, meditative work of forcing warmth into stone. She worked from the inside out, then from the outside in, double sealing every gap she could find, running her bare palms across the finished surfaces in the evenings to check for drafts, the way a doctor checks for fever with the specific, practiced attention of someone who understands that what they cannot feel might still kill them. The walls changed under her hands, not visibly, not dramatically. This was not the transformation of a story sudden and legible. It was the transformation of real work, which happens in increments too small to observe. And then one day you stand back and the thing is different. The loose pile of fieldstone that had been her inheritance from the town's discard pile was becoming something else. It was becoming a shell. A continuous sealed integrated shell that the wind would have to work considerably harder to penetrate. She tested it each evening with a candle, moving it slowly along the base of each wall, watching the flame. The flame told the truth. Where the clay was tight, and holding the flame stood upright, mild, and certain as a well-made decision. Where a gap remained, where the wind still had its finger in the flame, bent sideways with the small decisive lean of a compass needle finding north. She followed every lean. She filled every gap. By the morning of the 22nd of November, the candle stood straight in every corner of the room. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she had made. Her hands were a record of the 9 days the clay ground into the creases of her knuckles, the split skin across her fingertips, the nails broken down to nothing. She had stopped feeling the individual pains 3 days ago. They had merged into a single ambient condition, the way multiple sounds in a room eventually become atmosphere. She was not done. She was not close to done. But the walls were sealed, and that was the foundation on which everything else would rest. She went to the spring and washed her hands in the water that came up from the deep earth at its constant, patient temperature. The cold of it was clarifying, not punishing. It reminded her every time of the physics of the fact that the earth below her feet maintained its own climate, regardless of what the sky was doing, and that this was not a miracle but a property, and that properties could be worked with. She looked at the notebook's drawing of the roof. She looked at the open sky above her head. She went to find timber. The forest that edged the hillside above the Springhouse had not been logged. It was too steep, too rocky. The trees too scattered and gnarled to be worth the effort when better timber was available closer to town. The loggers had passed it by with the efficient contempt of men who have quantities to meet. What they had left behind was not marketable timber, but it was wood-fallen trunks and thick branches, and the leaning silver skeletons of trees that had died standing and were waiting for a wind strong enough to finish the argument. Maren spent 3 days in that forest. She dragged. She rolled. She used the lever principle her grandfather had explained to her when she was 7 years old. Find the fulcrum, concentrate the force, let physics do the arithmetic to move logs she could not possibly lift. She learned the specific grammar of her own body's capability during those 3 days, the precise vocabulary of what she could and could not accomplish alone. She did not push past the limits she couldn't push past. She worked within them with the focused creativity of someone who understands that the available materials are the available materials and complaint is not among them. She built the new rafters across the collapsed section of the roof, working from the solid remaining timbers outward, notching the new logs to sit in the gaps in the existing stone walls. She tested each one with her weight before trusting it with anything more. She was precise about this. One structural failure at this stage would cost her more time than she had. On top of the rafters, she laid a dense mat of smaller branches and pine boughs, interwoven and overlapping a thatch that would form the substructure for what came next. Then she climbed the hillside with the shovel. The notebook had been specific about the sod. Not just any turf, the top layer of the Dakota prairie was bound together by the roots of the native grasses in a fibrous matrix that made it structurally cohesive, almost like a manufactured material. You cut it in blocks, grass, and roots, and a good 4 inches of the soil matrix beneath, and what you had was a building material of remarkable insulating capacity. The roots held moisture. The soil held heat. The grass, even dormant, trapped air in its structure. And the whole living assembly laid in overlapping courses like shingles would knit itself together over time into something approaching monolithic. She cut the blocks with the flat of the shovel, working along the hillside in rows, lifting each piece and carrying it back down on the makeshift ramp she had built. The blocks were heavy, 15-20 pounds each, some more. Her shoulders began to make their complaint on the first day of this work, and escalated steadily through the second and third. She ignored the complaint with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the complaint is noted but not dispositive. 2 layers, then 3. She packed the joints between blocks tight, tamping them down with the heel of her boot, feeling the roof under her hands grow dense and solid and present. She prayed in a practical rather than devotional way that the rafters would hold. They held. Then the berm. This was the largest and most exhausting single task of everything she had done or would do. The earth she had excavated from the trench along the north and west walls weeks ago, now piled against the south side of the structure, to keep it out of the way, had to be moved. All of it. Around the building and up against the exposed faces of the north and west walls, built up in a long, gradual slope from ground level to the eaves. She was not burying the building. She was pulling the earth up around it like a blanket pulled up around a sleeping child. She was extending the thermal mass of the deep ground up the flanks of the structure, so that the wind, when it came in from the north with everything it had, would meet not stone but earth, a surface that absorbed and dispersed and offered nothing for the cold to get purchase on. She worked with the shovel and with her hands, and on the steeper sections with a flat piece of scrap timber she used as a scraper. She moved earth for 4 full days. Her back, which had been complaining since the first week of this enterprise, moved past complaint into a kind of grim, silent endurance that she respected, as she would have respected it in another person. The berm grew, a foot, 2 feet. By the end of the 3rd day, it had reached her waist on the north wall. By the end of the fourth, it reached the eaves, a long, gentle slope of Dakota earth that looked from a distance like a natural feature, like the hillside had simply decided to extend itself a little further in this direction, which was, in a sense, exactly what had happened. Inside, she built the water channel. The notebook's drawing of this element was the most detailed of anything Petra had recorded. More detailed than the roof design, more annotated than the berm. As if Petra had understood that this was the heart of the system and had wanted to leave no ambiguity about how it worked. The spring emerged from the fissure in the bedrock at the back of the structure. In its natural state, it simply bubbled up, collected in the shallow stone basin the original builders had made, and ran out through a gap in the foundation. It had been doing this for as long as anyone could remember, indifferent to whether anyone was using it or not, maintaining its constant temperature with the equanimity of something that has never known a different state of being. Marin's task was to interrupt this natural course, gently, temporarily directing the water through a shallow stone channel that would run along the base of the interior back wall before rejoining the main flow and exiting the building. The channel would expose the water's surface to the air of the interior. The water at 50 degrees would release its thermal energy continuously into the air of the room and into the stone wall beside which it ran, not dramatically, not with the roaring declaration of a wood stove burning at full draw, but constantly, without pause, without consuming any fuel, without requiring any maintenance. The earth would keep that water at 50 degrees in January as reliably as it kept it there in July. The channel would keep that energy where she needed it. The sealed, insulated walls and the heavy sod roof, and the banked earth would hold it in. It was not a fire. It was something older than fire. The steady, unhurried generosity of the planet's own interior warmth, channeled and directed and put to work. She built the channel from flat stones she gathered from the creek bed, fitted together without mortar in a shallow trough, testing the grade with a thin trickle of diverted water until she had it right. A gentle, reliable flow that moved the water along the wall and back out without pooling, without stagnating. Clean, constant, alive in its own quiet way. She sat on the stone floor and watched the water move through its new course for a long time. She thought about Petra, about an old woman in a Carpathian village in the winters before the crossing, understanding this same principle by different means, by observation, by necessity, by the accumulated knowledge of generations of people who had lived in proximity to the deep earth, long enough to understand its character, who had figured out through the specific patient intelligence of survival that the planet was willing to help if you were willing to listen. That knowledge had crossed an ocean in a leather-bound notebook. It had waited in a cedar chest for decades. And now it was here, in a hollow in the Dakota hills, being drawn out of the notebook and into stone and earth and flowing water by a 23-year-old woman that a town had decided was too small a problem to bother solving carefully. She built the cold sink next. This was simpler, a pit 2 feet deep just inside the interior side of the doorway. The physics were elegant. Cold air is denser than warm air. Any cold air that managed to enter the space when she opened the door would flow downward into the pit and stay there, unable to rise and displace the warmer air above. It was not a perfect seal. Nothing was a perfect seal, but it reduced the thermal cost of every entrance and exit significantly. And in the accounting, she was keeping every degree, every hour, Every unit of warmth preserved significantly mattered. The door she built last. She salvaged planks from the collapsed section of the original roof structure, old wood dried and dense, the grain tight from slow growth. She fitted them together with wooden pegs and a simple cross brace, insulating the interior face with layers of dried moss she had gathered from the north side of the oak trees. And over the moss, a skin of rabbit hide from 3 animals she had snared over the course of the previous 2 weeks. The trapping had been patient, necessary work, the kind that rewarded stillness and attention rather than effort. She had been still and attentive. She had been rewarded. She hung a heavy blanket over the interior face of the finished door for additional insulation. She set the door in its frame on the morning of November 28th. She looked at it for a moment. A plain, ugly, entirely functional door. Nothing like the grand carved doors of the cabins on Copper Falls Main Street. Nothing that announced itself. Nothing meant to be looked at. A door meant to work. She pushed it closed. It fit tight. She had planned the edges twice to get it right, shaving the wood down until the fit was close enough that she had to push with deliberate pressure to seat it fully. She turned around inside the Springhouse. The interior was small, 10 feet by 10 feet of space that most of the men in Copper Falls would have dismissed as barely adequate for a storage room. The walls were sealed. The roof was 3 layers of sod over pine bough thatch over notched timber. The channel moved its quiet water along the back wall. The cold sink waited just inside the door. The floor was the original flagstone cold now, but with the capacity she knew to hold heat once the system had time to establish itself. She lit a candle. The flame stood straight up. She moved it to each corner of the room, each wall, the door frame, the base of the roof where it met the walls. She held it near the floor, near the ceiling in the middle of the room. The flame did not waver. Not once, not a flicker. No draft, no infiltration, no cold finding its way in from the world outside. She set the candle on the small crate she was using as a table. She stood in the center of the room. The air was cool, not warm, not yet. The system needed time to charge, needed the water's slow generosity and the stone's slow acceptance to build up the thermal reserve that would make the room genuinely livable. But it was a different coolness from the outside air. It was the coolness of a cellar in summer stable enclosed at temperature that belonged to a system in equilibrium rather than to an environment at the mercy of whatever the sky decided next. She put her hand flat on the back wall beside the channel where the water ran. The stone was cool under her palm, but it was alive in a way she hadn't expected. Not warm exactly, but present. As if the stone were aware of the water moving alongside it, were in conversation with. It were slowly, incrementally being convinced. She sat down on her bedroll. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. She had not planned this, had not timed it, had simply finished when she finished. But it was there, the soft, muffled quality of the air, that snow brings, the particular silence of a world being covered. She could not hear the snow falling. She could not hear the wind. She could not hear the sound of Copper Falls a quarter mile away going about its business. She could hear the spring, its small, steady voice moving through the stone channel. The most reliable sound in the world, because it came from a source that could not be depleted, could not fail, could not be rationed or hoarded or taken away by a man with a ledger. She sat for a long time and listened to it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than triumph and more durable. She felt the specific quality of a thing that has been completed correctly, not celebrated, not remarked upon, simply present holding its own weight. She did not feel cold. She established the routines of the new life during the first days of December. Water from the spring, which required only the removal of the small wooden cover she built over the channel's entry point. The snare she reset every 2 days, working the line of rabbit runs along the base of the hillside. The small store of dried food she had packed. Berries, smoked fish, the dried corn she had ground into a rough meal, supplemented by what the snares provided. The candle she burned only in the evening, doing the day's work in whatever gray light filtered through the single small opening she had left in the south wall, fitted with a piece of oiled animal membrane that let light through without letting cold in. The temperature inside settled. It took about a week. The stone walls absorbed the water channel's steady offering and began to give it back. Not extravagantly, not with the dramatic warmth of a roaring fire, but with the constant, even release of a surface that has taken heat into its mass and holds it the way old wood holds the smell of smoke. Something in the range of 52, 53 degrees, cool by the standards of comfort, survivable by the standards of survival, and survivable without burning a single piece of wood, without depending on a wood pile that was being rationed in the town behind her, without placing herself at the mercy of anything that could run out. She slept deeply for the first time since Henrik died. Not the anxious, surfacing sleep of someone braced for the next difficulty, but the long, genuine sleep of a body that has been worked completely and has been offered an environment in which it can actually rest. She did not dream about Henrik. She had expected the quiet and the warmth and the specific enclosed intimacy of the small space to open up that grief, the way warmth opens a wound that cold has kept numb. But what came instead was simply sleep, and then morning and the sound of the spring and the work of another day. She thought this might be its own kind of healing, not the healing of forgetting, but the healing of continuing, of the body committing to the next thing, because the next thing was there and required committing to. On the 4th of December, 3 days before the storm, Elias Croft rode past again. She was outside resetting the eastern snare when she heard the horse on the track above the hollow. She looked up. He was alone this time, heading back down from the high country. The logging runs were finished for the season, the last timber in from the hills. He would have seen the Springhouse as he came down the track, or rather he would have seen the hillside that had absorbed it. The long, gentle berm, the sod roof now carrying an inch of snow on its surface, the small plume of vapor rising from the spring's outlet where it emerged from the base of the mound. He stopped. She watched him looking at it. She could not see his expression from where she stood. She could see only the shape of him on the horse, the broad, set shoulders, the head slightly forward in the posture of a man examining a thing he is trying to categorize. He looked for a long time. Then he looked down the slope and saw her standing in the snow with the snare wire in her hands. Their eyes met across the distance. She did not move. He said nothing. He did not repeat his prediction of ice and folly. He simply looked at her for a moment, or she thought he did. though the distance made certainty impossible, and then he turned the gray horse back toward town and rode away. She watched until he was gone. Then she went back to the snare. The blizzard announced itself the way serious things announce themselves, not with drama, but with a quality of silence. It was the silence that came first on the evening of December 4th. The wind that had been a constant presence for weeks simply stopped. The tree branches stopped moving. The air went absolutely still and intensely, specifically cold, colder than it had been, colder in a way that was different in kind from what had come before. A cold that felt not like temperature, but like intention. The old-timers in Copper Falls felt it in their joints and went to their wood piles and counted what remained and felt something they would not describe as fear, because they were not men who described things as fear, but which functioned in the physiological sense exactly as fear functions. The sky on the morning of December 5th had a quality that the younger people in town would not have been able to name. The older ones knew it. It was the yellow-green light of a sky that is preparing to spend the next week doing one specific thing and is committed to the task entirely. The wind returned at noon. It came from the north, and it was not the wind they knew. The winter winds of the Dakota plains were familiar, fierce cold, biting, the kind of winds that songs were written about and that men talked about in bars with the proprietary pride of survivors. This wind was something else. This wind had no interest in being weathered or survived or talked about later. It came with a horizontal torrent of snow that reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the first 2 hours. In the town of Copper Falls, behind the proud hewn timber walls of its log cabins, the battle began. Marin heard it arrive. She heard it as a change in the quality of the silence inside the Springhouse, a deepening, a pressing, as if the world outside were leaning against the walls. But the walls did not respond. She put her palm against the north stone, the face that was entirely buried in the berm, the face the wind was hitting first and hardest, and felt nothing. The stone was cool and steady. The berm absorbed what the stone didn't. The storm threw itself at a hill, and the hill received it with the complete indifference of accumulated earth. She lit the candle. The flame stood perfectly straight. She could hear nothing of the blizzard. Not the wind, not the driven snow, not the particular tearing sound it made against the wooden structures of the town she had left. She was inside the earth. The earth was not having a storm. The earth was having a Tuesday. She took out her mending. She was working on a pair of wool socks she had unraveled and was reknitting. The wool was good, worth the labor of reclaiming it. She sat on her bedroll with her back against the stone wall that the water channel ran alongside, and she felt the wall's slow, constant, generous warmth against her shoulder blades, and she knitted by candlelight while the storm conducted its business outside. She thought about the town. She thought about the woodpiles that had been looked at with growing anxiety since October. She thought about the gaps in the chinking that the cold would be finding and widening. She thought about the high cathedral ceilings of Elias Croft's grand structures, drawing the heat up and away from the people huddled at floor level. She thought about iron stoves burning twice as fast as calculated, because the calculations had assumed walls that held. She did not think about this with satisfaction. She was not built for satisfaction of that particular kind. She thought about it with the specific muted grief of someone watching a thing fail that she had seen coming and had not been able to prevent. She knitted. The candle flame was steady. The spring moved through its channel in the dark. The storm pressed against the hill, and the hill held. On the second day, Bertha Olmsted's cabin began to fail. Bertha had built the cabin herself 14 years ago, after her husband Clement had died of a kick from a horse and left her with $300 and a piece of land on the east edge of town. She had built it small and careful, and had maintained it with the same stubborn, practical competence she brought to everything. But it was old now, and the cold that was coming in through the widening gaps in the walls was not the ordinary cold she had weathered for 14 Dakota winters. It was the other kind, the kind without precedent. By the second morning of the storm, the temperature inside her cabin with the stove burning was 34 degrees. She had 2 days of wood left. On the third day, the wood in Elias Croft's private store ran out. This was not supposed to be possible. He had laid in what he calculated as 3 months of fuel, a calculation based on 37 years of Dakota winters and the specific thermal performance of his own buildings, which he knew as well as he knew anything. But the buildings were performing differently than his calculations had assumed. The cold was finding ways in that his experience hadn't prepared him for, and the great iron stoves were trying to compensate and failing. And the fuel was going into the stoves, and the heat was going into the walls, and out through the gaps, and into the storm, which did not care and was not grateful, and needed none of it. Eleanor Croft had begun to cough on the first night of the storm. By the second night, the cough had settled into her chest with the specific claiming quality of an illness that has found the conditions it was looking for. She lay in the bed of the main room they had abandoned the sleeping loft, as too cold wrapped in every blanket in the house, her face pale and damp in the failing warmth of the stove's last heat. Elias Croft sat beside her and fed kindling into the stove, and felt for the first time in 37 years of building things in this territory that he did not know what to do. This was not a feeling he had a language for. He had built his interior life on the same principles. He built his buildings sound foundations, load-bearing members properly identified and positioned. No structural element asked to carry more than its calculated capacity. A man who knew what he was doing it correctly, produced reliable outcomes. This was the axiom on which everything else rested. But his wife was shivering under 4 blankets 2 feet from a stove he could no longer fuel, and the walls he had built with his own hands were failing to hold the heat. And outside, the storm was doing something that his experience had told him was not possible. And all of his calculations were producing the wrong answers. He looked at the window opaque with blown snow. He thought about the widow. He had thought about her intermittently since the storm began, a fleeting, unwelcome thought that he pushed aside each time with the reasonable argument that she was certainly dead by now, that her folly had ended the only way it could have ended, that his judgment had been correct. But the thought kept returning, and each time it returned, it brought with it a detail he could not quite account for: the plume of vapor he had seen rising from the base of that snow-covered mound. The way the hillside had looked different from the track, settled and present, in a way that didn't match his expectation of what should be there. He looked at Eleanor. Her breathing had a catch in it that he didn't like. He made a decision. Not a decision built on hope. Hope was not a load-bearing material, and he knew it. He made a decision built on the only thing he had left, which was the willingness to be wrong about something, if being wrong was the only path forward. He put on every layer he owned. He wrapped his face in his scarf and pulled his hat low. He picked up the coil of rope from the hook by the door, a reflex of the experienced man rope in a whiteout always, and he tied one end to the porch post. He stepped outside. The storm hit him like a physical collision. The cold was beyond cold. It was a presence dense and purposeful. The cold that had no name pressing against every inch of exposed skin with immediate, serious intent. The wind was horizontal and scouring. He could see nothing beyond his own outstretched hands. He moved by memory. He had walked this ground 10,000 times. He knew where the track ran, where the creek crossed, where the hollow began to drop away to the northwest. He moved carefully, methodically, one foot placed deliberately before the other, the rope playing out behind him. His connection to the known world, his guarantee that he could find his way back. The half-mile took him an hour. He nearly missed it. The Springhouse was so completely absorbed into the landscape, buried in drifted snow, its berm invisible under 3 feet of accumulation, nothing to distinguish it from the hillside it had become, that he stumbled past the entry before the faint warmth of the spring's vapor outlet stopped him. He felt it before he saw it, a slight softening of the lethal air near the ground, a different quality to the cold. That was not quite warmth, but was the absence of the deepest cold. He clawed at the snow with numb hands, found the top of the door, shoveled snow away with his forearm until he could reach the latch. He told himself what he expected to find. He was honest with himself about it, in the way that a man alone in a storm is forced into an honesty that the presence of other people makes easier to avoid. He expected to find her dead. He had come to confirm it because a man who made decisions had to follow them to their conclusions, had to be willing to look at what his decisions had produced. He braced himself. He opened the door. The air that came out was not what he expected. It was not the air of death of a sealed space that had given up. It was cool. Notably, genuinely cool compared to the killing temperature outside, and it was alive. It smelled of earth and stone and water and the faint green smell of growing things, the impossible herbs in their small clay pots, set beneath the candle on the crate. He fell rather than stepped through the doorway. His legs had been working for an hour at the absolute edge of their capacity, and they registered their complaint upon arrival at the threshold. He looked up from the stone floor. Maren Voss was sitting on her bedroll with her back against the wall. She had a wool sock in one hand and a knitting needle in the other. She looked up at him with the expression of someone who has considered many possibilities and has learned to receive what actually arrives without excessive reaction. The candle on the crate burned without a single tremor. He could not hear the storm. The temperature in the room was something he estimated in the distant automatic way that his builder's mind kept working even when the rest of him had stopped at 55 degrees, perhaps a little more. The kind of temperature you'd find in a root cellar in late autumn. The kind of temperature that, measured against the lethal conditions outside, was the difference between life and the end of it. He heard the water before he understood what he was hearing. The small, continuous, completely calm voice of the spring moving through its stone channel along the base of the wall. He heard it, and he looked at it, and he understood what it was doing, and the understanding arrived not in words, but in the physical experience of a man who has spent his life thinking about heat and cold and the relationship between materials and temperature. He understood it the way you understand something when it reaches you below the level of the intellect, at the level of the body itself. He was a builder. He had built good things. He had built them with skill and precision and genuine devotion to the craft. But he had built them on a premise that he now understood in this small, warm, earthbound room, while the storm screamed against a world that this room could not hear, had been wrong. He had built structures that fought the cold. He had fought the cold for 37 years, and the cold had been fighting back. And this winter, the cold had fielded a force that his structures could not match. And his wife was lying in the ruin of his best work, with a cough that frightened him. He tried to speak. "Ow," was what came out. One syllable stripped of everything except the need to know. Maren did not answer immediately. She looked at him, at his frozen beard, his wax-pale, frost-bitten cheeks, his hands that had gone the wrong color, with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that required assessment before response. Then she did something that surprised him. She did not point to the walls, or the roof, or the channel. She did not explain. She simply looked at the room around them, a slow, encompassing look from floor to ceiling, from the back wall with its running water to the sealed door with its blanket-draped face. And then she looked at him and waited. He looked where she had looked. He saw it. He saw all of it, the berm and the sod and the stone and the water and the cold sink in the flat flagstone floor that was. He reached down and pressed his palm against it. Not cold. Not warm. Something in between. Something in equilibrium. He saw the system. He saw that it was complete, that it was self-sustaining, that it required nothing from outside itself, that it would run as reliably tomorrow as it ran today and next week, and for as long as the spring ran, which was longer than either of them would live. His throat worked. "Eleanor," he said. The name came out differently from how he'd said any name in recent memory, stripped of authority. Just the name of a person he was frightened for. Maren set down the sock. She set down the needle. She looked at him steadily. "Bring her," she said. 2 words, not forgiveness. He understood that clearly. And he did not insult her by receiving them as forgiveness. Not generosity exactly in the sense of a gift. Something more fundamental than either. The simple, direct response of a person who understands what is necessary and is willing to do it regardless of what preceded it. He got to his feet. His legs held barely. "There are others," he said. "Then bring them." He turned to the door. He put his hand on the latch. The storm was on the other side of it. He could feel it against the door's resistance, the insistence of it. He thought of something and turned back. "Why?" he asked. Not why the building worked. He understood why the building worked. He meant something else. He meant, why are you willing? Why after everything? Why does a woman who was handed a sentence say yes to the man who handed it? Maren looked at him for a long moment. "Because it's cold outside," she said. He stood with that for a moment. It was not the answer he expected, which meant it was almost certainly the truest answer available. He opened the door and went back into the storm. The rope saved his life. He had not untied it from the porch post before leaving some reflex of the experienced man, some muscle memory of 37 winters in this territory that had acted before the conscious mind could override it with the urgency of the errand. Now on the return journey, blind in the horizontal white, The rope was the only fact in the world he could trust. He followed it back hand over hand, feeling the fibers between his numb fingers, letting the line make the decisions that his failing navigation could not. His beard had frozen solid again within minutes of leaving the Springhouse. His eyelids were trying to seal themselves. He moved through the storm the way a very old man moves through a dark room slowly, carefully, entirely dependent on touch. He reached the porch post. He went inside. Eleanor was exactly where he had left her, which meant she had not gotten worse in the hour he had been gone, which was the best thing he could say about her condition. She looked at him from the bed with eyes that were too bright, the brightness of a fever looking for somewhere to go. He knelt beside her and took her hands in his frozen ones and felt the contrast between them, her heat and his cold, two extremes meeting at the junction of their clasped fingers. He explained what he had found. He explained it briefly in the practical language she would understand and respond to without drama, and without the fuller reckoning that was waiting for him on the other side of this night. There would be time for that. First, there was the immediate fact of keeping her alive. She listened. She nodded. She said, "Then let's go." This was why he had married her. Getting Eleanor from the cabin to the Springhouse was the hardest thing Elias Croft had done in 37 years of hard things. He built the sledge in 40 minutes from the planks of the kitchen table and the rope he had brought back. He packed her in blankets until she was a bundle more than a person, only her eyes visible between the wool layers. He tied the rope to the sledge's front cross member and fashioned a harness for his own chest and shoulders, and he pulled her out into the storm. The wind hit the bundle of blankets like a sail and tried to use it. He leaned into his harness and pulled. The snow was above his knees in the drifts and compressed to ice in the open stretches, alternating without pattern, demanding a different stride every few feet. He navigated by the position of the wind on his left cheek. North wind, keep it on the left walk until the ground starts to drop, and by the dark shape of the hill that he could occasionally see through the driven white when the gusts paused for a breath. It took nearly 2 hours. When the Springhouse door opened and the wave of cool living air came out to meet them, Eleanor made a sound he had not heard from her in the 4 days of the storm. A sound of simple, unambiguous relief. The sound of a body recognizing safety before the mind has finished processing it. He pulled the sledge inside. He closed the door. He turned around. Maren was already moving. She had cleared space on the far side of the room, laid out the extra blankets, positioned the bedroll against the wall beside the water channel, where the stone's slow warmth would be closest. She moved without fuss, without ceremony, without the particular performance of helpfulness that is actually about the helper. She moved the way she had moved through all of this, Elias thought, as if the work itself were the only thing that existed, and she were simply the instrument through which it got done. He helped Eleanor off the sledge and onto the prepared bed. Eleanor looked around the small room, the sealed stone walls, the candle flame that did not move, the water running in its channel, the sod roof low overhead, the smell of earth and moss, and something green and alive. She looked at it with the directness of a woman who has been a builder's wife for 30 years and understands what she is looking at. "Good work," she said quietly, not to Elias, to Maren. Maren looked at her. Something passed between them that Elias witnessed but could not fully read, some communication of the specific frequency that passes between people who have been underestimated by the same person and have each survived it in their own way. Rest, Marin said. Eleanor rested. They came in ones and twos over the next 6 hours. Bertha Olmsted arrived at dusk on the 5th of December. Guided by the rope that Elias had left strung from the Springhouse door to the nearest point of the main track, a thread of guidance through the white chaos, something to hold on to in the blind violence of the storm. She came with her coat and her boots, and nothing else, because there had been nothing else to bring. She stepped inside, and her face did the thing that every face did when it entered that room. For the first time, the involuntary recalibration, the reassessment of what was possible, the small private adjustment that happens when the world reveals itself to be other than expected. She looked at Marin. Her expression contained everything she did not say, and would not say the full weight of, "I was wrong about this, and I watched you go, and I brought bread to the edge of your determination, and called it charity and walked away." She sat down against the east wall and pulled her coat around her, and did not speak for a long time. Then came the Hartwell children, 3 of them, Thomas, who was 11, and the twins Nora and James, who were 8, brought by their father, who had wrapped them in oilskins and walked them through the storm, with one child's hand in each of his, and the third holding on to his coat. His name was August Hartwell, and he was a logger who had been in the high country when the storm started, and had made it back to town on the first day to find his woodpile already critically short. He left the children and turned to go back out. "Where are you going?" Marin asked. "Corrigan and his boy are still in the east cabin," Hartwell said. "He's 64, and the boy's got a bad chest." Marin nodded. She handed him the second length of rope she had coiled by the door. She said nothing else. He took it and went back into the storm. He came back an hour later with old Corrigan, who was 71 and not 64, and who was doing the specific, efficient shivering of a body that has been cold for 4 days and has begun to consider alternatives. Behind them came Corrigan's grandson. Not his son, the boy was 12, named Edmund, who had the wide eyes of a child, who has understood something fundamental about the world in the last 4 days and will not ununderstand it. 2 men from the logging crew came at nightfall, having followed the rope line from the track by feel in the dark. They introduced themselves as Swede and Paulson, which were not explanations of their names so much as placeholders, and they sat down against the south wall and were asleep within 10 minutes. The sleep of men whose bodies had made an executive decision. 12 people in a 10 by 10 room. Elias Croft looked at the room and calculated automatically, in the way he always calculated square footage volume, the thermal implications of 12 bodies generating heat in a sealed space. He ran the numbers twice. Then he stopped running them, because the numbers kept coming out impossible, and the room kept being real. 12 people. The candle flame continued its perfect stillness. The spring continued its patient conversation with the stone. The temperature in the room, if anything, had risen slightly. The addition of 12 human bodies to a sealed, insulated space was not a trivial contribution to the thermal budget. No one was cold. The days inside the storm had their own quality of time. Outside, the blizzard conducted itself with the relentless, impersonal fury of a natural process that has no investment in outcomes. It built drifts against the south face of the berm that eventually reached the roofline and then continued past it burying the Springhouse entirely beneath a 6-foot blanket of snow, which was, as Marin understood, and Elias slowly came to understand, not a threat, but a gift. Snow is an extraordinary insulator. The structure was now not merely protected by 3 feet of sod and earth, it was wrapped additionally in 6 feet of packed snow. Its thermal integrity improved rather than compromised by the very force that was destroying everything else in the territory. Inside time moved differently. It moved at the pace of the spring, which was the pace of the earth, steady, unmeasured, indifferent to the urgency of the surface world. The 12 people in the room established over the first 2 days the unconscious social order of a group that has been stripped of all non-essential things and has retained only what actually matters. Marin managed the water. She made sure the channel ran clear, checked the spring's outlet twice daily to ensure it hadn't been blocked by ice. She distributed the food her own stores supplemented by what the others had brought or salvaged with the careful arithmetic of someone who has had practice rationing things that cannot be replaced. There was enough. Not abundantly, not comfortably, but enough which, in a blizzard that was now in its 4th day, was the same as everything. She showed the Hartwell children how the cold sink worked, explaining it in the direct physical terms that children respond to better than abstraction. She showed Thomas where the spring emerged from the rock and let him put his hand in the water and feel its impossible steadiness. She watched his face when he understood the specific quality of a young mind encountering a physical fact that revises its model of how the world operates. Eleanor's fever broke on the 2nd day inside the Springhouse. It broke the way fevers break when the body is finally given a stable, sufficient environment, not dramatically, not with crisis, but with the quiet receding of something that no longer had the conditions it required. She slept for 14 hours and woke up asking for water, and the quality of her voice was different from how it had been fuller, with the resonance of a person coming back to herself. Old Corrigan's hands were frostbitten. Marin treated them with what she had, the dried herbs from Petra's chest ground, and mixed with tallow from the rendered rabbit fat, applied to the damaged skin, and wrapped in strips of clean cloth. She did not know with certainty that this was the right treatment. She knew it was what her grandmother had indicated in the notebook for cold-damaged tissue, and she knew that Petra had survived things that made the current situation look manageable, and she proceeded on that basis. Corrigan did not lose the fingers. On the 5th day of the blizzard, the 12th of December, Elias Croft sat in the dark of the early morning and could not sleep. The others were sleeping around him. He could hear the specific breathing of 12 people in close quarters, the deep unconsciousness of the exhausted, the shallow flutter of the recovering, the steady rhythm of the children. Eleanor slept against the east wall, her breathing clear for the first time in days. The candle had burned down, and he had not replaced it. The room was in a darkness that was not the darkness of outside, not the darkness of a storm, but the darkness of an enclosed earth space, the ancient mineral dark of caves and cellars, and the interior of the planet shot through with the small sound of water. He sat with this darkness and this sound, and the particular quality of his own thoughts, which had been working towards something for 5 days and had arrived at it without his full consent. He was a man who had built his life on a set of propositions that he had never examined, because they had never failed him badly enough to require examination. The frontier rewarded conquest, Nature was an adversary. Strength was the application of superior force. A man who understood these things could build anything, could weather. Anything, could make correct decisions about what was load-bearing and what was ornamental, and organize the world accordingly. He had organized the world accordingly. He had organized Marin Voss accordingly. Assessed her as ornamental, as a structural liability, as a problem that the community could not carry. He had done it efficiently and without malice, and with the complete confidence of a man who has been correct about structural assessments for 37 years. He looked across the dark room to where she was sleeping, the shape of her. Under the blanket, her short, cropped hair dark against the stone. She had been awake until very late, tending to Corrigan's hands, checking the channel, making sure the children were properly covered. She had, as far as he could determine over 5 days of close observation, not slept more than 4 hours on any given night. She had eaten less than anyone. He thought about the door she had built. Ugly, functional, perfect. He thought about the cold sink, the elegant simplicity of it, not fighting the infiltrating air, but simply capturing it using physics instead of force. He thought about the channel, the way it had turned the spring from a feature of the landscape into a furnace. He thought about the berm, the sod roof, the chinking that held under conditions that had destroyed everything he had built with seasoned timber and iron hardware, and 37 years of expertise. He thought about the word he had used on the track. Folly. He had aimed it at her. He had used it with the casual accuracy of a man who is certain of his target. And he had been wrong, not in the small correctable way of a miscalculation, but in the foundational way of a man who has been operating from the wrong premise for so long that the error has become load-bearing. Everything built on top of it had the flaw built in. He had built coffins, beautiful, precise, dovetail-jointed coffins, and he had put people in them and told them they were homes. She had built a house. He sat with this for a long time. He was not a man who arrived easily at the acknowledgement of being wrong. He had not been built for it, had not practiced. It had over decades of being correct about most things, lost the flexibility that the admission required. He felt it now like a structural load. He had not calculated for heavier than expected, pressing down on the framework of who he understood himself to be. He did not try to push it off. He sat with it. He let it press. She was awake. He realized it without seeing her move, some quality of the dark around her that was different from the quality of the dark around sleeping people. "You're awake," he said quietly. Not a question. "Yes," she said. The spring moved in its channel. The sleeping people breathed their various rhythms. Outside, 6 feet above their heads, the blizzard continued its work. He thought about what he wanted to say. He had been thinking about it for hours and still did not have a version of it that felt adequate to the actual thing, which was perhaps the nature of adequate. It is always slightly smaller than the actual thing. The map always slightly smaller than the territory. He said it anyway. "I came out here to see you dead." He heard her still in the dark. Not a startled stillness, a listening one. "I knew what I was coming to find," he continued. "I told myself I was coming to see to the body, to do the necessary thing. But the truth is, I needed to find you dead, because that was the only outcome in which my judgment was sound. If you were dead, I was right. If you were right, He stopped, found the next part. Everything I've built here, everything I told myself I understood, it needed you to be dead. The spring moved. Someone shifted in sleep across the room. I have been wrong about things before, he said. Boards' feet, grade, how much a particular soil will settle. I have been wrong and I have corrected and I have moved on. But I have not been wrong about, he searched for the word, about the kind of thing I was wrong about here, about what a person is worth, about who gets to decide what's possible. He looked at his hands in the dark. He could not see them. He knew them anyway, every scar, every thickness, every callus that was the physical record of what he had built and how he had built it. I handed you a sentence, he said. I was very certain about it. The silence after this was not empty. It was the silence of someone choosing carefully. You were certain, Maren said. Her voice was even neither warm nor cold, the voice of a person speaking a fact rather than an accusation. You've built everything in this town. You know how to build. I understand why you were certain. That's generous, he said. It's accurate, she said. Generous would be pretending the rest of it didn't happen. He accepted this. It was precisely the right distinction, and he had not earned better. What your grandmother drew, he said after a while. Where did she learn it? From her mother, Maren said. And her mother from hers. From people who lived in the mountains for a long time and had winters that made this one look mild. People who couldn't build what you build, didn't have the timber, didn't have the iron, had to learn what the earth was willing to offer. He thought about this, about knowledge that travels through generations in a leather notebook, about expertise that gets dismissed as old-world superstition by men with newer tools and louder confidence. I've been building the wrong way for 37 years, he said. You've been building for a different problem, she said. You built to show what men could do. These buildings say something. They mean something to the people who live in them. A pause. They just don't work well enough in January. He almost smiled. It surprised him. No, he said. They don't. They sat in the dark, and the spring spoke in its steady voice, and the storm moved over them without touching them. I'll fix it, he said. What I can fix. The cabin, it's yours. I'll have Gaines clear the ledger, publicly. You're owed that. He paused. I'll learn what you're willing to teach. If you're willing. She did not answer immediately. He did not expect her to. A question like that, coming from where it was coming from, deserved the time it took to answer honestly. I'll teach what my grandmother taught me, she said finally. It doesn't belong to me any more than it belonged to her. It belongs to whoever needs it. He nodded in the dark. Then I need it, he said. The blizzard ended on the morning of December 14th. It did not end dramatically. It simply stopped the way sustained things sometimes stop. Without announcement. Without the theatrical diminishment of a storm in a story. 1 hour, the wind was there, and then it was not, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that several of the sleepers woke to it, as they would have woken to a loud sound. Maren was the first one out. She pushed the door open against the drift that had built against it, and climbed up through the snow into a world that was white in every direction and absolutely still and lit by a winter sun so low and bright it seemed to be apologizing for its recent absence. The landscape was remade. The familiar features of the hollow, the creek line, the track, the distant roof lines of Copper Falls were buried or altered beyond recognition. Drifts had reached heights she would not have believed a week ago. The oaks that edged the hollow were sculptures, now their branches loaded with accumulated white, frozen in positions of arrested motion. She stood on top of the Springhouse, stood on what had been her roof and was now simply the surface of the hill, the building beneath her entirely invisible, entirely intact. She looked at the town. Even at this distance, she could see the damage. A roof line had collapsed. She thought it was the feed store on the south end of Main Street. The church steeple, which had leaned slightly east for as long as she could remember, had resolved its argument with gravity in the night. Several cabins showed the dark gaps of failed walls chinking, blown out by the sustained assault of the winds. The proud, grand, ambitious buildings of Copper Falls had fought the storm and had been marked by the fight. One by one, the others climbed out behind her, Eleanor steadier on her feet than she had been in days. The Hartwell children who immediately sank to their waists in the nearest drift and had to be hauled out by their father. Old Corrigan squinting in the light. Swede and Paulson who stood side by side looking at the town with the expression of men who have been reminded of something they thought they knew. Elias Croft came out last. He stood beside Marin and looked at what remained of what he had built. He looked for a long time without speaking. "How many, He asked. The question meant losses. People. "We'll know soon," she said. They went to find out. The town had lost 6 people. 3 of them in a single cabin on the east edge of town. An old couple and their adult son found together when the cabin's north wall was cleared of snow and opened. The cold had come in so gradually and so completely in the final days of the storm that they had not died in crisis. They had simply stopped. The other 3 were men who had attempted to move between buildings during the storm's second night, for reasons no one would ever know. With certainty, they were found in the morning of the 15th, in the drifts between. 6 people. It was a number that settled over the town like the snow itself, heavy, transforming a weight that would not lift with the storm. The survivors of the Springhouse moved through the days after the blizzard with a quality of attention that the others noticed. They moved differently, not with survivor's guilt, which is a kind of turned inward focus, but with an outward careful attention to the immediate and the practical. The specific focus of people who have spent 7 days in a room where only the necessary existed and have not yet readjusted to the luxury of the unnecessary. Marin organized the immediate relief effort with the same quality she had brought to everything else, without drama, without taking up more space than the task required, simply identifying what needed to be done and doing it. She directed the digging out operations, deciding which structures to prioritize, based on a quick assessment of which were most compromised and most occupied. She walked through the damaged cabins with Elias Croft and spoke in technical terms about what had failed and why. He listened. He asked questions. He took nothing for granted and assumed nothing he had previously assumed. He had never in 37 years been a student of anything. He had been the teacher, the authority, the man whose opinion settled questions. He found that being a student at 58 required a specific kind of muscular effort, the effort of holding his existing knowledge aside to make room for something new. It was harder than any physical work he had done. He did it. On the 10th of March, 1888, when the worst of the winter had passed and the first uncertain gestures of spring were appearing along the creek bank, a green spike of new grass. Here the swollen red of willow buds there. Elias Croft called the town council together in the provision store. He had never in his memory called a meeting to say he was wrong. He had called meetings to announce decisions, to present assessments, to settle disputes from a position of established authority. This meeting was different, and the people who came to it knew it was different, though none of them could have said exactly what quality of the invitation told them so. Maren was there. She stood near the back of the room, which held perhaps 30 people, most of the surviving population of Copper Falls, crowded among the dry goods and hardware and the smell of sawdust and coffee. She had not dressed for occasion. She wore her work dress and her rassoled boots and the wool shawl Bertha Olmsted had brought to the Springhouse on the second day of the storm, and had on departure quietly left behind. Elias Croft stood at the front of the room. He spoke without preparation. This was unusual for him. He was a man who planned his words with the same care. He planned his buildings, measuring them for load and fit before placing them. But the prepared version had felt like another structure built to impress, and he had set it aside. He spoke about the winter. He spoke about what had failed and why. He spoke with the specific technical vocabulary of a builder, which gave what he was saying the quality of a professional assessment rather than a confession, though it was both. He told them what he understood now about thermal mass and infiltration, and the particular cruelty of high-ceilinged rooms in the kind of cold they had just survived. Then he walked to the back of the room. He stopped in front of Maren. He reached into his coat and produced 2 pieces of paper. The first was a page torn from Rutherford Gaines's ledger. Henrik Voss's debt account. Every entry, every interest calculation, every month of compounding. He held it up so the room could see it. Then he tore it in half and in half again and placed the pieces on the counter beside him. The second piece of paper was the deed to the cabin on the north end of town. Henrik's cabin. He held it out to Maren. "Paid in full," he said. His voice was level and clear and carried to every part of the room. "By a wisdom greater than anything in that ledger. By knowledge that this woman carried here through conditions I told her she couldn't survive, to a place I told her wasn't worth the ground it sat on, and built something that saved the lives of 12 people, including my wife." He paused. "I was wrong about the ground. I was wrong about the woman. I am correcting the record publicly because the wrong was done publicly." The room was very quiet. Maren looked at the deed in his outstretched hand. She looked at it for a moment in the way she looked at all things that required consideration, directly without the social performance of either eagerness or indifference. Then she took it. She did not make a speech. She was not, had never been a woman who made speeches. She said, "Thank you," in the voice she used for accurate statements, and she folded the deed and put it in her pocket. What she did with it 3 days later was give it to the Hartwell family. August Hartwell and his 3 children who had lost their own cabin to the storm's assault on the east wall and had been living in the charity hall since the thaw. She transferred the deed without ceremony, presenting it to Hartwell on a Tuesday morning with the same directness she brought to everything. He stared at it. "I can't," he began. "You can," she said. "Henrik would have wanted it used. He built it to be lived in." She went back to the Springhouse. She went back because it was hers in the way that the cabin had never quite been. Not by deed or by law, but by the specific, unambiguous claim of having built it yourself, from a pile of discarded stone, with your own hands in the cold alone. That summer, Copper Falls began to change. It changed the way real things change, not all at once, not with the dramatic reinvention of a story, but gradually, materially, in the specific physical ways that reflect a shift in understanding, rather than just intention. Elias Croft led the retrofitting of the existing cabins with the same energy he had once brought to building them, but differently, with questions rather than pronouncements, with attention to what the ground was doing, rather than declarations about what men would do to the ground. He dug stone foundations down below the frost line. He built berms against north walls. He redesigned the hearths, smaller, smarter, surrounded by tons of field stone and cob, that held the heat long after the fire died down, radiating it slowly back into the rooms through the night. He replaced the massive, inefficient chimneys that had been sucking warmth out of rooms with insulated designs that kept the heat where it was meant to be. The new homes that went up on the edge of town that summer were different in character from the originals. They were lower. They sat closer to the earth. Their roof lines were gentle rather than proud, their walls thicker and less theatrical. They did not announce themselves. They did not raise a fist at the sky. They worked. People from other settlements came to see them. Word had traveled the story of the blizzard of the widow's Springhouse of 12 people alive in a stone room, while the territory lost its worst winter in recorded history. It traveled the way useful stories travel, with the freight of genuine information attached, and the people who came were not coming to marvel, but to learn. Marin received them at the Springhouse, which had become, without her planning it, without her seeking it, the center of what people were coming to understand. She spread her grandmother's notebook open on the flat rock outside the door and stood beside it, and explained what was in it with the directness and precision she brought to all explanations. She spoke about thermal mass, about geothermal principle, about the difference between fighting the cold and understanding it. She was not a performer of this knowledge. She did not dress it up or make it larger than it was. She presented it the way Petra had recorded it, as practical, tested physical fact, as the accumulated intelligence of people who had lived close to the earth for long enough to learn what it was willing to teach. Bertha Olmsted came regularly that summer, not to learn the building principles. She had neither the land nor the remaining years to build, but to sit near the spring and drink the cold, clear water and talk. They talked about Clement, who had been dead for 14 years, and about Henrik, who had been dead for a year now, and about the specific ongoing work of being a person after the person who organized your life is no longer there to do it. These conversations happened in the particular register of two women who have been through the same kind of hard thing by different routes, and have arrived at an understanding that does not require them to pretend the hard thing was anything other than what it was. Old Corrigan, whose fingers had healed completely, came once to show her his hands. He held them up in the summer light, the frost-bitten tips pink and whole and present. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. He held up his hands, and she looked at them, and they both understood what was being communicated. and that was enough. The Hartwell children came often. Thomas, who had understood the cold sink, who had put his hand in the spring and felt the earth's patience, had developed a focused, serious interest in how the building worked that went beyond curiosity into something that looked like vocation. He came in the evenings sometimes and sat with a notebook tracing the drawings with a careful finger, and Marin answered his questions with the same attention she would have given to any serious person's serious questions, regardless of his being 11 years old. Elias Croft came every week. He came as a student genuinely without the performance of humility which is its own form of pride. He asked questions that were sometimes basic and sometimes sophisticated, and always honest. He brought his own observations from the building work, things he had noticed about how the retrofitted cabins were performing, problems he had encountered in adapting the notebook's principles to the specific conditions and existing structures of Copper Falls. He brought these as genuine questions, rather than as problems he expected her to solve for him, and she appreciated the distinction. They worked well together, she found. He had a builder's precision and a builder's patience with the physical details of how things actually fit together, and these were genuinely useful in translating Petra's mountain country principles into Dakota Territory practice. He had spent 37 years learning things about this particular ground, this particular climate, this particular timber and stone, and that knowledge was not wrong. It simply needed to be reorganized around a different premise. He never mentioned the night in the Springhouse, the conversation in the dark. She appreciated this too. He did mention it once indirectly. He said, standing beside her, looking at a new building's north berm on a warm July afternoon, "I keep thinking about what I almost missed." He said it quietly, not as a conversation opener, but as a thought that had finished itself out loud without intending to. She considered it. "You didn't miss it," she said. "I nearly did." "But you didn't." He looked at her. She was looking at the berm, her eyes moving along its line, checking its grade, the way she checked all things with complete attention, nothing left over for performance. "No," he said. "I didn't." They went back to work. The winters still came to Copper Falls. They came as they had always come from the north, with the particular Dakota combination of cold and wind, and the specific bleakness of a landscape that does not soften itself for human habitation. They came as they had always come, and they were always hard, and sometimes they were very hard. And in the years that followed the winter of 1887, there were storms that tested the new buildings and the new principles and the new understanding of what shelter actually meant. But the buildings held. Not perfectly. Nothing holds perfectly, and Marin was the first to say so. The first to walk through a retrofitted cabin after a hard February and identify where the principles had been partially applied and where the cold had found the gap and what needed to be done. She was a rigorous teacher, not in the sense of demanding, but in the sense of honest. She did not allow the story of what had happened to calcify into mythology, which is where useful things go when people stop questioning them. The Springhouse remained. She did not rebuild it or improve it dramatically. It did not need improvement. She added small things over the years. A better shelf for the herb pots. A second oil membrane window on the south wall to increase the winter light. A stone bench outside the south door, where she could sit in the early mornings when the season allowed it. Petra's notebook stayed on its flat rock in the good weather, and came inside in the bad. It was handled by many hands over the years, and it acquired the specific patina of a thing that has been genuinely used. New fingerprints over old new smudges of clay and charcoal from builders who had been using it to figure out something specific and had set it down on the job. Maren thought sometimes about her grandmother, about a woman born in the Carpathian Mountains in the first half of the 19th century, who had crossed an ocean and built a life in a country that did not have a template for her, who had understood things that the confident, progressive, iron stove-equipped men of the American frontier had never thought to ask about, who had taken a lifetime of knowing and pressed it into the careful pages of a notebook and trusted it to the future, to a granddaughter she would not live to see grown with a single line of faith written across the last page. If you find this, you are already brave enough. She had found it in the dark, in the cold, in the last hours before she had to become something different, or stop being anything at all. She had found it, and she had believed it. Not with the easy belief of someone who has been given good reasons to believe, but with the hard, specific belief of someone who has nothing else to proceed on and decides to proceed anyway. This, she thought, was what knowledge actually was. Not the finished thing, not the drawing on the page, not the principle in the text. The finished thing was just the residue. What knowledge actually was the decision to proceed on the basis of it, the choice to trust what the earth was offering over what the confident voices were warning, the willingness to dig when they told you the stone would kill you, and to keep digging when you weren't sure yourself. The winters came, the buildings held. The spring moved through its channel in the dark of the small earthen room at its constant patient temperature, as it had moved before she arrived, and would move after she was gone. The warmth of the earth offered without condition to whoever was willing to receive it. She received it.